The wind did not merely blow across the high desert of the New Mexico territory. It scoured. It was a living, malevolent thing that carried the taste of copper and ancient dust, stripping the paint from the siding of the house and the hope from a man's soul. Judson Hale stood on the porch of what had once been a grand ranch house, watching the horizon bleed into a bruised purple as the sun dipped below the mesas. The silence here was heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. It was the silence of a graveyard, which was fitting, considering that was exactly what the Double H Ranch had become. He was 40 years old, though the sun and the whiskey had carved deep ravines into his face, making him look 10 years older. His hands, resting on the rough railing, were calloused maps of hard labor and violence. He wore his solitude like a heavy coat. To the people in the town of San Mateo, 10 miles east, he was a ghost story, a warning to children, or a madman who spoke to cattle and shot at shadows. They were not entirely wrong. The feud that had decimated his family was over in the way a fire was over after it had consumed the forest. The Hatfields and McCoys had nothing on the blood spilled between the Hales and the Duggans. It had ended 5 years ago, with 3 fresh graves on the rise behind the barn and a silence in the main house that Judson could never quite scrub away. He lived in the kitchen and the bunkhouse mostly, leaving the main rooms to the dust and the spiders. He squinted, pulling the brim of his hat lower. A dust plume was rising in the east. It was too thick for a single rider and too erratic for a cattle drive. He watched it with the impassive suspicion of a man who expected nothing good from the world. It was the overland stage, the one that ran the dangerous route between Santa Fe and the lower territories. It was limping, listing heavily to the left. Even from this distance, the crack of wood splintering echoed across the canyon floor. The vehicle lurched and died a quarter-mile from his fence line. Judson did not move to help. He rolled a cigarette with methodical slowness, licked the paper, and struck a match against his boot heel. Let them sit, let them taste the grit. He wanted no company, and certainly not the soft-handed travelers who passed through looking at his land as if it were a painting and not a place that killed you for a mistake. But the desert had a way of forcing a man's hand. An hour later, the driver had unhitched the team. Judson watched through his brass spyglass. He saw a well-dressed couple arguing with the driver, pointing fingers, their gestures frantic. Then he saw the other passenger. She stood apart from the rest. She was dressed in black, a heavy, suffocating bombazine that must have been torture in the heat. She stood by a trunk that looked as battered as the coach. The driver mounted one of the horses. The wealthy couple mounted the others. Riding double. They were leaving, and they were leaving the woman in black behind. Judson lowered the glass, a curse dying on his lips. He waited for them to turn back, for the driver to hoist her up. They did not. The riders became specks in the distance, heading toward San Mateo, leaving the woman standing alone in the vast, indifferent scrubland as the light began to fail. She did not sit down. She did not wail. She simply stood there, a dark smudge against the sagebrush. Judson crushed his cigarette under his boot. He spat into the dust. He walked to the barn, not hurrying, but moving with the resigned gait of a man walking toward a chore he despised. Clara May felt the vibration of the earth before she heard the horse. She was thirsty. It was a thirst that had moved past discomfort into a sharp, throbbing pain behind her eyes. Her lips were cracked, and the taste of the road was a permanent film in her mouth. When the wheel had shattered, the driver, a man named Silas who possessed the empathy of a rattlesnake, had made a calculation. The banker and his wife had money to pay for the horses. Clara had nothing but the trunk at her feet and the silver ring on her finger. "I will send someone back for you." Silas had lied. His eyes had not met hers. She knew he would not. She was a widow with no coin, no kin, and no prospect. In the hierarchy of the frontier, she was less valuable than the saddlebags they had taken with them. She watched the rider approach. He was a dark silhouette against the dying sun, mounted on a massive bay gelding. As he drew closer, she saw the rifle scabbard, the worn leather chaps, and the face that looked as if it had been chiseled from granite. He stopped the horse 10 feet from her. The animal blew air through its nostrils. stamping a hoof. The man said nothing. He sat high in the saddle, looking down at her with eyes the color of gunmetal. "I have no water," Clara said. Her voice was a dry rasp, but she held her chin level. She would not beg, not yet. "I see that," the man replied. His voice was a low rumble, rusted from disuse. "The driver said he would send help. He lied." The man shifted his weight. "He will be drinking in the saloon in San Mateo in 2 hours. He won't remember your name." Clara felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She knew he was right. She looked at the vast emptiness around them. The sun was touching the mountains now, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. "Is your ranch near?" "Near enough. I have no money to pay for transport. I didn't ask for money." He looked at her trunk. "That stays. I'm not hauling dead weight." Clara put a hand on the battered leather lid. Everything she owned was in there. Her husband's Bible, her mother's shawl, the few dresses she had managed to save from the creditors. "I cannot leave it." "Then you stay with it." He gathered his reins, turning the horse's head. Panic, sharp and white-hot, flared in her chest. "Wait." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "I can work," she said. The words tasted like ash. "I am strong. I can cook. I can mend. If you have shelter, I will trade labor for it." Judson Hale looked at her. He saw a woman who was too thin, too pale, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of grief and hunger. She was pretty in a severe, broken way, like a china cup glued back together. But he saw trouble. A woman on the ranch meant questions. It meant softness. It meant memories he had buried under 6 feet of earth. "I don't need a cook," Judson said coldly. "And I don't need a woman. Walk to town if you have the legs for it. It is 10 miles east. Follow the wheel ruts." He kicked the horse into a trot, leaving her in a cloud of dust. Clara watched him go. She watched until he disappeared into the folds of the land. Then she grabbed the leather handle of her trunk. It was heavy, filled with the ghosts of her past life. She began to drag it. She would not leave it. It was all she had to prove she had existed before this moment. She walked toward where he had gone. 10 miles was a death sentence in the dark, but the ranch was closer. She had seen the roof line. She would walk until she fell. Night arrived with a violence peculiar to the high desert. The wind picked up, howling down from the peaks, carrying sand that stung like buckshot. The moon was obscured by driving clouds of grit. Judson sat at his kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey and a cold plate of beans before him. The wind rattled the window panes in their frames. The house groaned, the timber settling in the chill. He poured a glass, drank it in one swallow, and poured another. He could not get the image of her out of his mind. The way she stood there, stubborn as a mule, hand on that worthless trunk. "She's likely dead by now," he said aloud to the empty room. The sound of his own voice was startling. He drank again. The wind shrieked, a high, mournful sound. He slammed the glass down. Damnation! He grabbed his lantern and his coat. He did not take the horse. The animal was spooked by storms. He walked out into the gale, shielding his eyes. The sand was blinding, a wall of abrasive darkness. He walked toward the gate, swinging the lantern. He found her 300 yards from his porch. She had collapsed. The trunk was still gripped in her hand. Her fingers locked around the handle in a rigor of determination. She was half buried in a drift of sand, her black dress flapping wildly in the wind. Judson knelt, shielding her face with his body. She was cold, her skin clammy. He pried her fingers from the trunk. "Leave it!" he roared over the wind. She moaned, barely conscious, thrashing weakly as he lifted her. She was light, shockingly so. He hefted her into his arms, leaving the trunk to the mercy of the storm, and carried her back to the house. He kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the roar of the night. The silence of the kitchen rushed back in. He laid her on the rug before the hearth. Her face was gray, coated in dust. Her lips were blue. Judson built up the fire, cursing steadily, a stream of foul language that was his only defense against the intrusion of humanity into his world. He fetched a blanket and threw it over her. He did not undress her to warm her. He would not touch her more than he had to. He sat in the chair, his rifle across his knees, and watched her breathe. Shallow, ragged breaths. She woke up an hour later. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and terrified. She scrambled backward, hitting the leg of the table. "Easy," Judson said. He did not move from his chair. "You are in my kitchen. You nearly died out there." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. She recognized the hard lines of his face, the gun-metal eyes. "My trunk." "Outside, if the wind doesn't take it. I'll fetch it in the morning." She slumped, the adrenaline fading, leaving her trembling. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I brought you in because I didn't want to dig a grave in the morning. The ground's too hard." It was a cruel thing to say, and he meant it to be. He wanted to scare her. He wanted her to run as soon as the sun came up. Clara slowly sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She reached into the pocket of her ruined dress. Her hand shook as she withdrew a piece of paper. It was folded into a small square, worn at the edges from being handled 1,000 times. "I told you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have nowhere to go. My husband is dead. His family. They took the house. They took the land. They said I was bad luck." Judson said nothing. He poured coffee from the pot on the stove into a tin cup and shoved it across the table toward her. She ignored the coffee. She unfolded the paper. "I wrote this down," she said. "When I left Tennessee, I told myself I would do whatever I had to do to live. I am not a beggar, sir. I pay my way." She looked at the paper, then at him. Her eyes were dark, brimming with a terrified resolve. She read aloud, "3 times a day, I will be your wife." The silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. Judson stared at her. He looked at the paper, then at her face. A harsh, barking laugh erupted from his chest. It was a sound devoid of humor. "Lady," he said, leaning forward, the firelight casting deep shadows in the hollows of his eyes. "This ain't a church, and I ain't no groom. You think I want a wife? I can barely tolerate a dog." Clara did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. "I do not mean love," she said. "I do not mean romance. I mean the duties of a wife. I will cook. I will clean this house. I will mend your clothes. I will tend your garden. And I will warm your bed 3 times a day, if that is the cost of a roof." Judson recoiled as if she had slapped him. The bluntness of it, the transactional coldness of it, shocked him. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was trembling, not from cold, but from shame. She was offering the only thing she had left, stripping away her dignity to survive. "You think you can just walk in here and sell yourself like cattle?" Judson growled. "I ought to throw you back out in the storm." "But you won't," she said softly. "Because you are angry, but you are not a monster. I see that." Judson stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He paced to the window, looking out at the blackness. He was lonely, God. He was so lonely it felt like his bones were hollowing out. But this was madness. "One night," he said, his back to her. "You stay tonight. The storm will break by dawn, maybe 2 nights, to get your strength back. You work for your keep. You clean this sty of a kitchen, but keep your wife duties to yourself. And after 2 days, then you move on. I'll take you to town." "I have nothing in town," she said, "but I accept your terms for now." Judson turned back. She had finally picked up the coffee cup. She drank it with both hands, the steam rising around her face. She looked like a child and an old woman all at once. "Sleep on the rug," he said roughly. "Don't go wandering the house." He went to his room and locked the door. He did not sleep. He lay on his bed, listening to the wind, aware of the stranger in his kitchen, aware of the strange, terrifying offer hanging in the air. 3 times a day. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The wind had died, leaving the world scoured and bright. The sun was a pale disk rising over the purple bruises of the distant mountains. Judson walked into the kitchen. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he stopped dead. The kitchen was different. The table had been scrubbed. The floor was swept. The ashes had been cleared from the hearth and a fresh fire crackled. The smell of bacon and strong coffee filled the air, masking the scent of old dust and stale whiskey. Clara was standing by the stove. She had found an apron somewhere, likely one that had belonged to his mother. It was too big for her, wrapped twice around her waist. Her black dress was brushed clean of the worst of the mud, though it was still wrinkled. She turned as he entered. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She held a mug of coffee out to him. Judson took it, wary. "I told you, I don't need—" Clara stepped forward. Before he could react, she stood on her tiptoes. She placed her hands on his shoulders. Her touch was light, tentative, but firm. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his rough, unshaven cheek. It was not a lover's kiss. It was precise, deliberate, a seal on a document. She pulled back, looking him in the eye. "That is once," she whispered. Judson stood frozen, the coffee cup halfway to his mouth. The spot on his cheek burned. He wanted to shout at her, to tell her to stop this foolishness, but the words stuck in his throat. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the steel rod that ran through her spine. She was keeping her word, even if he had not agreed to the terms. "I told you," he rasped, stepping around her to get to the door. "I don't want it. Drink your coffee," she said, turning back to the bacon. "It is hot." He fled to the porch. He sat on the steps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He touched his cheek. The land stretched out before him, dry and cracked like an old boot. The cattle were scattered, searching for the sparse tufts of yellow grass that poked through the red dirt. A coyote yipped somewhere in the distance, a lonely, high-pitched cry that usually echoed the emptiness inside him. But today, the silence was broken by the clatter of pans from the kitchen. The isolation of the ranch was usually a physical weight. The wind howled constantly, a ceaseless reminder that humans did not belong here. The days were long stretches of heat and labor, the nights longer stretches of memory and regret. He drank the coffee. It was better than the swill he made. Judson spent the day fixing the corral fence, working with a ferocity that exhausted him. He wanted to be away from the house. He wanted to forget she was there, but he found his eyes drifting toward the windows. She was not idle. He saw her dragging rugs onto the porch to beat the dust out of them. He saw her hauling water from the pump, her thin frame straining with the buckets. She worked like a woman who was terrified that if she stopped, she would cease to exist. In the afternoon, he saw her walking down to the creek that cut through the lower pasture. He should have looked away. A gentleman would have looked away. Judson Hale had not been a gentleman in a long time. He watched from the shadow of the barn. She set a bucket down. She washed her face and arms, the water glistening on her pale skin in the harsh sunlight. She was humming. The sound carried on the thin air, a low, mournful lullaby that sounded like something from the deep south. "Hush, little baby. Don't you cry." The melody twisted something inside him. It reminded him of a time before the blood, before the graves. That night, he ate the stew she made in silence. It was rich, seasoned with sage she must have found near the creek. "The trunk," he said abruptly, breaking the silence. "I brought it to the barn. It's safe." "Thank you," she said. She did not smile, but her shoulders relaxed a fraction. Later, Judson lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Usually, the nightmares came as soon as he closed his eyes. The sound of gunshots, the smell of smoke, the face of the boy he had killed. But tonight, the house felt different. There was another heartbeat within these walls. Clara lay on the rug in the kitchen, wrapped in the blanket. She could not sleep. She listened to the house settle. She heard Judson toss and turn. She heard him cry out once, a sharp, strangled sound, and then the creak of bed springs as he sat up. She heard the distinctive metallic clack-clack of a lever-action rifle being cycled. He was awake. He was armed. The next day, she saw him with his shirt off by the water pump, washing the grime of the day from his body. She had come around the corner of the house to empty the slops and stopped. His back was a map of violence. There were scars that looked like old whip marks, thin white lines crisscrossing his shoulders. There was a puckered, ugly crater near his ribs that could only be a bullet wound. And there were burns, shiny and smooth, on his left arm. He was a ruined building of a man, held together by anger and silence. Clara stepped back before he saw her. She pressed her back against the rough wood of the house, clutching the empty bucket to her chest. She had come here for survival. She had offered herself as a wife to a stranger because she had no other currency. She had expected a brute, or a lecher, or perhaps a simpleton. But Judson Hale was none of those things. He was a man in a cage of his own making. She touched the silver ring on her finger. She thought of the note folded in her pocket. 3 times a day, she took a breath, steeled herself, and walked back into the kitchen to start the fire for the noon meal. She would keep her bargain. She would force life back into this dead place, even if it killed her. Judson came in 10 minutes later, his shirt wet and clinging to his skin. He looked at her with that same wary suspicion. "Stew is warm," she said. He nodded. He sat. Clara walked over to him. She placed a plate of cornbread on the table. Then she leaned down. He flinched, just slightly. She kissed his forehead this time. It was cool and damp from the water. "That is twice," she whispered. She turned and walked out the back door before he could say a word, leaving him sitting there, the taste of cornbread in his mouth and the ghost of her touch burning on his skin like a brand. The 2 days turned into a week. The week began to bleed into a second. Clara May did not just clean the kitchen, she laid siege to the entire house. She moved with a quiet, relentless energy that Judson found both unnerving and, to his deep shame, comforting. She beat the dust of 5 years out of the rugs in the parlor, a room he had not entered since the funeral. She scrubbed the windows until the harsh, bright sun streamed in, illuminating the layers of grime and neglect. She found his mother's lye soap recipe in a kitchen drawer and spent a day rendering fat, the smells sharp and clean. A domesticity so foreign it felt like an invasion. She did not just cook, she organized. She took stock of his meager supplies, the endless bags of beans and flour, and began to make calculations. She ventured into the root cellar, emerging with cobwebs in her hair and a few withered potatoes, which she declared a victory. She also learned to work the land. She had told him she was strong, and she proved it. He woke one morning before dawn to the sound of his axe splitting wood. He found her by the wood pile, his heavy axe raised over her head, bringing it down with a grunt, her slight frame shuddering with the impact. "That's my axe," he said from the porch. "It is," she agreed, not pausing. She set another log. "And you are low on kindling. The mornings are cold. That's man's work." "It is work," she corrected, swinging again. "And it needs doing." He took the axe from her, his hand closing over hers on the handle, and the contact was like a static charge. Her skin was rougher than he expected, calloused already. He finished splitting the pile in a grim, furious silence, the rhythmic thwack of the steel echoing in the dawn. She did not thank him. She simply gathered the split wood and carried it inside. He found he had a shadow. When he rode out to check the fence line in the southern pasture, she was there, a bonnet on her head she must have found in her trunk, carrying wire and a pair of his pliers. "I can mend a fence," she said simply, walking past him. She could. He watched her pull the wire taut, her small hands bracing against the post, her movements economical and precise. She did not complain about the sun, or the dirt, or the way the wire bit into her hands. She just worked, her mouth set in a thin, determined line. Judson was slow to thank her for any of it. To thank her would be to admit she was useful. To admit she was useful would be to admit he needed her. And Judson Hale needed no one. He told himself this every morning. He found himself watching her. He watched her hang his long johns on the line, the gesture so mundane, so wifely, that it made his stomach clench. He watched her as she sat on the porch steps in the evening, brushing her long, dark hair, the strands catching the fading light like threads of copper. He remembered other hands, softer hands. The memory would hit him without warning. Usually when he saw Clara, he would be mending a bridle in the barn, the smell of leather and hay filling his nostrils. And he would look up. Clara would be gathering eggs from the hen house, her head bent. And suddenly, she would be Eliza. Eliza, with her bright corn silk hair and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. Eliza, who had been promised to him since they were children. She had been the reason this ranch existed. His father and her father had shaken hands on the land, a truce sealed by a future marriage. Then the Duggans had come, claiming the water rights to the Cimarron Creek, the lifeblood of both ranches. Judson would drop the bridle, his hands shaking. He would see the scene play out behind his closed eyelids, as vivid and terrible as if it were happening again. The argument at the creek bed, the dust, the shouting, his father trying to be the peacemaker, and Micah Dugan, the eldest son, a boy with a cruel mouth and eyes as empty as a snake's. Micah had always wanted what was not his. He had wanted the land, and he had wanted Eliza. Judson had been there. He had been standing not 10 feet away. He heard Micah's laugh, a high, ugly sound. "This land is ours, hail, and so is anything on it." He saw Micah's gaze land on Eliza, who was standing by the wagon. He saw his own fiancée, brave and foolish. "Step forward. You have no right. Micah Dugan, this is hail land." "It's all just dirt, Ellie," Micah had said, patting the pistol on his hip. "And we're all just waiting to be planted in it." Then the flash, the boom that echoed off the canyon wall. Eliza crumpled. Not a dramatic fall, just a simple folding, settling into the dust, a dark stain spreading on the bodice of her blue gingham dress. Judson's own rifle had been in his hand before he knew it. He didn't remember aiming. He just remembered the look of stunned surprise on Micah Dugan's face as the first bullet took him in the chest, and the second in the throat. Judson had not stopped there. He had hunted the Duggans. He had retaliated, as the old book said, an eye for an eye, until the feud had burned itself out. Leaving 2 families in ruins and 3 graves on his hill, he would open his eyes, the barn silent save for the shifting of the horses. Clara would be gone, back to the house. But the guilt remained, a sickness in his gut. He had avenged Eliza, and in doing so, he had killed the last part of himself that was human. Love was a weakness. It invited the knife. It was a vulnerability that always ended in blood and dust. He fought this thawing sensation with a grim purpose. He became harder, colder. When she asked him a question, he gave a one-word answer. When she set his plate before him, he did not look at her. He was trying to freeze her out, to make the ranch so cold that she would leave of her own accord. But Clara was made of sterner stuff than he knew. A few days later, Judson was trying to break a half-wild bronc, a mean-eyed sorrel he had bought cheap. He was distracted, his mind still on the graves. The horse sensed his hesitation. It ducked its head, swapped ends, and threw him. He landed hard, the ground unforgiving. The impact sent a bolt of white-hot pain through his left shoulder, the one with the old bullet wound. He lay in the dust of the corral. The wind knocked out of him, cursing. Damnation. Hellfire! He heard the house door slam. Clara ran to the fence, her skirts hitched up. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he snarled, pushing himself to his feet. The pain was nauseating, a sharp, grinding ache. He waved her away. "Get back to the house. I don't need a nurse." He limped back to the barn, his pride as bruised as his shoulder. He managed to unsaddle the horse with his one good arm. His teeth gritted. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, trying to eat the stew she had made, but he could barely lift the spoon. The pain had settled into a deep, throbbing misery. He saw her watching him. "You are hurt," she stated. It was not a question. "I'm fine," he repeated. "You are a terrible liar, Mr. Hale." She disappeared into the back rooms and returned with a small, dark bottle. "My husband, Elias, he had pains. This is liniment. It smells foul, but it helps." I don't want it. Take off your shirt. He stared at her. Woman, I told you. Take off your shirt, she repeated, her voice quiet but unyielding. Or I will call you a coward as well as a liar. The challenge hung in the air. Judson felt a flash of fury, but it was overshadowed by the sheer exhaustion of the pain. With a growl, he unbuttoned his shirt, hissing as he pulled the fabric over his bad shoulder. The scars on his back were stark in the lamplight. Clara stood behind him, and he felt her go still. He waited for the gasp. The question, it did not come. She uncorked the bottle. The smell of wintergreen and camphor filled the room, sharp and medicinal. She poured the oil into her hands, rubbing them together. Judson tensed, his muscles rigid as stone. Her hands landed on his shoulder. They were not soft. They were chapped and strong from work, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. She worked the liniment into the knotted, scarred muscle, her thumbs pressing deep. It hurt like fire. But as she worked, the heat of her hands and the pungent oil began to unlock the knot. The pain began to recede, replaced by a dull, warm throb. Judson sat with his eyes closed, his head bowed. He had not been touched with kindness in 5 years. Not since Eliza. He was rigid, fighting every instinct that told him to lean into the touch. Her fingers traced the old, puckered scar of the bullet wound, then the thin, white lines of the whip marks. She said nothing. She just worked, her breathing soft and even in the quiet kitchen. After a long time, she capped the bottle. She moved to the wash basin, rinsing her hands. Judson slowly, carefully, moved his shoulder. The sharpness was gone. He could breathe again. He turned to look at her. She was standing by the sink, her back to him, drying her hands on the apron. That's, he began, but the word thanks wouldn't come. She turned. Her face was pale in the dim light, her eyes dark and unreadable. That is 3, she said softly. The words hit him like a physical blow. This was not a wife's duty. This was simple, human kindness. He had been so focused on the physical bargain she had offered. He had not recognized this. She had tended his wounds. She had shown him care. He put his shirt back on, his movements slow. He sat down, staring at the table. She did not go to her bed on the floor. She sat across from him, in the chair he usually occupied. You should leave, he said, his voice rough. This is no place for you. I have nowhere to go, she answered, the same words she had said the first night. Why? You're a young woman. You're decent. Why come west to this? Nothing? Clara looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. I told you I was married, to a preacher's son, Elias. She spoke to the table, her voice low. He was a good man, at first, quoted scripture, his father's pride, but he had a sickness for the bottle, and when he drank, the devil got in him. Judson watched her. He had seen men like that. He would preach on Sunday, his voice full of fire and brimstone. She continued. And on Monday night, he would use his fists to drive the sin from me. He said I was a temptation. He said I was the serpent in his garden. Her voice was flat, all emotion ironed out of it. When he died, he fell into the creek, drunk and drowned. His family, they are pious people. They said it was my fault, that my worldliness had dragged him to hell. They kept the farm. They gave me a train ticket west and told me never to come back. She finally looked up at him. I did not travel west to find a new life. Mr. Hale, I traveled west to disappear, to be somewhere no one knew my name. Or his. Judson stared at the woman across from him. She was not the broken bird he had first assumed. She was a piece of forged steel, beaten and reshaped, but not broken. A strange, unfamiliar emotion moved in his chest. It was not a desire. It was respect. Clara, he said. He used her name for the first time. You don't have to keep this bargain. The one you offered. She just looked at him, waiting. Stay, he said, the word costing him more than he thought possible. Stay as a housekeeper, a maid, I'll pay you $1 a day. Wages, not that. He was offering to change the terms. He was offering her a way out of the terrible bargain she had made, a way to make it a clean, simple transaction. She was silent for a long moment. She looked at the fire, then back at him. No. The refusal was soft, but absolute. What? Judson was stunned. I am offering you good money, a respectable position. I do not want your money, Clara said. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with a sudden, fierce intensity. And I do not want to be your maid. That is just another word for servant. But you don't have to love me, Judson, she said, and his name on her lips was as startling as her touch. You don't even have to like me, but let me be human here. Let me have the one thing Elias and his family took from me. What is that? He whispered. My choice. I chose my terms. They were desperate. Yes, but they were mine. When I kiss your cheek or tend your shoulder, I am choosing to give it. You are not buying it, and you are not taking it. It is my gift. Do you understand? I'm choosing to be human. Judson had no answer. He was checkmated. She had taken his world, his rules, and turned them upside down. They sat in silence for another hour. The fire burned down to embers. The wind howled outside, a lonely, restless sound. Finally, Judson stood. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark, empty land. He felt her presence behind him, a small, warm weight in the cold room. He turned. She was standing only a few feet away, watching him, her face a question. He had not intended to. He did not know when he decided, but he was moving. He closed the distance between them. He reached out a hand, calloused and scarred, and touched her face. He ran his thumb along her cheekbone. She did not flinch. She just watched him. You are playing a dangerous game, he said, his voice a low rasp. I am not playing. She replied. He leaned down. The kiss was hesitant at first. His lips were dry, chapped. Hers were soft, tasting faintly of tea and lye soap. It was a kiss of questions, a kiss of two people who had forgotten what kindness felt like. Then something broke in him, the loneliness, the years of solitary grief, the hunger for simple, human contact. He put his good arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him. His other hand went to the back of her head, tangling in her hair, and the kiss deepened. It was not gentle. It was desperate, trembling with years of loneliness, a drowning man's grasp for air. He felt her small body pressed against his, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. She was kissing him back, meeting his desperation with a quiet hunger of her own. And then he saw it, the flash of a blue gingham dress, the smell of gun smoke, the bright, terrible red stain. Eliza. He tore himself away, shoving her back so hard she stumbled against the table. The liniment bottle crashed to the floor. No, he gasped, his chest heaving. He was shaking, consumed by a sudden, violent shame. No, this is wrong. Clara stared at him, her lips parted, her eyes wide with shock and a new, terrible hurt. Get out, Judson roared. The fear and guilt had turned to rage. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. Get your things. I'll take you to town tomorrow. I want you gone. Get out of my house. He stormed into his bedroom, slamming the door so hard a pan rattled on the stove. He threw himself onto his bed, burying his face in his hands, his body shaking. He had done it again. He had let the weakness in. He had let her see him, and he had let himself feel. He listened, waiting for her to shout, to cry, to break something. But there was only silence. He lay there in the dark, his heart pounding, the whiskey bottle on his nightstand calling to him. He did not drink. He just listened. An hour passed. The house was tumblingly quiet, save for the wind. And then he heard it, through the thick wooden door, faint but unmistakable, a soft, stifled sound. She was trying to cry without making noise, a small, hitched breath, a quiet, desperate gulp of air. She was in the kitchen, on her rug, in the dark, and she was crying. Judson Hale closed his eyes. He had faced down murderers, rustlers, and the desert itself, but the sound of that quiet, hidden weeping was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard, and he was the one who had caused it. The thin gray light of dawn was a betrayal. It crept into the kitchen, revealing the floorboards, the cold stove, the overturned bottle of liniment that neither of them had touched. Judson sat at the table, a full, untouched bottle of whiskey in front of him. He had not slept. He had listened to the silence from his bedroom, a silence that was louder and more terrible than the weeping that had preceded it. He had waited for the sound of the door, for her to scream at him, to rage. Nothing, just the wind and the creak of the old house. Now, he heard movement, a soft stirring, the creak of a floorboard in the hall, then another in the kitchen. He did not look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in the bottle. Clara May walked past him. She did not look at him. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen and bruised with exhaustion, but her jaw was set. She went to the hearth, where the embers still glowed faintly. She added kindling, her movements precise, methodical. She pumped water into the kettle and set it to boil. Then she walked to the barn door, where she had left her trunk. She dragged it into the center of the kitchen. She opened the lid. Judson's hands clenched into fists on the tabletop. He was a coiled spring, every nerve alight with a toxic mix of shame, fury, and a fear so profound it tasted like copper in his mouth. He said nothing. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She began to pack. She folded the apron she had worn, the one that had belonged to his mother, and placed it inside. She folded the simple calico dress she had washed and mended. She packed the small tin of herbs she'd gathered from the creek. She was erasing herself from his home, piece by piece. Each folded item was an accusation. Each step she took was a judgment. He told himself this was what he wanted. He had ordered her to leave. He had pushed her away because she was a weakness, a crack in the wall of his defenses. Good. Let her go. Let him return to his silence, his ghosts, his numb, safe misery. She closed the lid of the trunk. The sound of the latch clicking shut was a death knell in the quiet room. She did not try to lift it. She knew she could not. She walked to the back door, put on the threadbare coat she had arrived in, and walked out. Judson sat there, frozen, for a count of 10. He heard the scrape of her boots on the hard-packed earth. She was not going to ask for his help with the trunk. She was not going to ask him to take her to town. He looked through the window. She was walking toward the barn. She's going to take a horse, he thought, a sudden, cold panic seizing him. She was going to saddle his mare, the one he favored, and ride away. He would be alone. The realization hit him not as a relief, but as a physical, suffocating blow. She was leaving, like Eliza, like his father, like his brother. Everyone who got close to him was consumed, and now she was escaping. He was on his feet before the thought had fully formed. The chair crashed backward onto the floor. He was out the door in 2 strides, his long legs eating up the distance to the barn. She was inside, in the dim, hay-scented air. She had a bridle in her hand, her arm outstretched toward the mare, who nickered softly. Judson slammed the heavy barn door shut. The boom of the impact was immense, shaking dust from the high rafters. The mare shied, pulling back with a snort of terror. Clara spun around, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes wide and dark in the sudden gloom. He stood there, backlit by the thin crack of light from the door he had just closed, a massive, terrifying silhouette. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "You were going to leave," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an accusation. "You told me to," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know what I told you." He stalked toward her. "You were going to leave me, just like all the rest. You were going to take the horse and run. I was going to town," she stammered, backing away until she hit the hard wood of a stall. You said you wanted me gone." "No." He was shaking his head, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. He was not seeing her. He was seeing Eliza's grave. He was seeing the empty chairs at his table. He was seeing 5 years of crippling, soul-eating loneliness. "No, you cannot go." He grabbed her. His hand closed around her upper arm, his fingers digging in like talons. She cried out, a small, sharp sound. He was strong, far stronger than her, and he dragged her from the barn, out into the bright, cold morning. "Judson, no, you are hurting me," she pleaded, stumbling to keep up with his frantic strides. He did not hear her. He was a man possessed, driven by a storm of fear, desire, and memory that had finally broken him. He hauled her back to the house, through the kitchen, past the trunk that stood like a tombstone in the center of the room. He dragged her down the hall to his bedroom. The room was stark, smelling of tobacco and old leather. The bed was unmade, the blankets twisted from his sleepless night. Bolted to the wall near the headboard was an old iron ring, once used for securing. He did not even remember. He threw her onto the bed. She landed with a cry, scrambling to get away, but he was on her. He had grabbed a length of chain from the porch, a heavy, rusted thing he used to drag logs. "No!" she screamed, the word finally erupting from her. She kicked, fought, her hands beating against his chest. It was useless. He was a man drowning in his own terror, and he was taking her down with him. He wrestled her wrist to the headboard, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. He looped the chain through the ring and around her small wrist, securing it with a heavy padlock. He stood back, the key in his hand, his chest heaving. Clara stared at him. She had stopped fighting. She was pulling at the chain, her movements jerky, her breath hitched. Then she looked at her wrist, at the cold, rusty metal. And then she looked at him. Her face was a mask of such profound, silent horror that it stopped his heart. There was no defiance, no anger, just the awful, uncomprehending terror of a person who has seen the face of a monster. You were gonna leave," he muttered, his voice shaking. He held up a hand, as if to ward her off, though she was the one in chains. You don't understand what that does to a man." He backed away, stumbling over his own feet. You made me feel again," he whispered. The accusation was terrible in its honesty. "You brought it all back. I was fine until you came. You cannot just, and then leave." He was at the door. Her silence was a physical weight, crushing him. "Judson," she whispered. His name was a broken sound. He could not bear it. He fled. He slammed the bedroom door shut, turned the key in the lock, and ran. He ran from the house. He ran until his lungs burned and the pain in his bad shoulder was a white-hot fire. He did not stop until he reached the high ridge, the one overlooking the entire valley, the one where the graves were. He collapsed by the 3 wooden crosses, his body convulsing. He was consumed by a tidal wave of guilt and shame, so vast it threatened to annihilate him. He had become Elias. He had become the brute. He had taken the one person who had shown him a flicker of kindness, and he had chained her like an animal. But even as the shame tore at him, a darker, more twisted logic fought for purchase. She was safe. She could not leave him. The panic that had been a constant companion for 5 years had receded, replaced by this sick, possessive calm. He had her. She was his. He spent the entire day on that ridge, at war with himself. The sun beat down, and he did not feel it. The wind picked up, and he did not notice. He was a man hollowed out, the demons of his past and the horror of his present circling each other in the empty space. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple, the chill brought him back. The cold snap of the high desert air. She was still there, chained. He had not given her food or water. The realization was a fresh blow. He stumbled to his feet, his legs stiff, and began to run back, a new, cold terror in his heart. The house was dark, silent. "Clara!" he called, his voice cracking. He fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking. The kitchen was empty. The trunk was still there. "Clara!" He ran to the bedroom, his heart hammering. He fumbled with the key. dropping it twice before he got it into the lock. He threw the door open. She was there. She was not dead. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up. She was wrapped in a blanket from his bed. Her face was turned toward the window, where the last of the light was dying. She did not look at him when he entered. He had brought a tray, stew, bread, a canteen of water. He set it on the floor, his hands trembling so violently that the water sloshed from the cup. He started. I brought... She said nothing. He knelt in front of her. The key to the padlock was in his hand. He reached for her wrist, and she flinched. A violent, full-body recoil that was worse than a slap. No, he whispered, a broken sound. I'm sorry. He fumbled with the lock. His hands were useless. Damn it, he was shaking too hard. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Clara. He finally got the lock open. The heavy chain slithered to the floor with a clatter. He backed away from her, on his knees. He was lower than she was. He lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. He had no more excuses, no more rage. There was nothing left but the raw, gaping wound of his own awfulness. I am sorry. He wept. He had not cried in 5 years. But the tears came now, hot and shameful. I don't know why. I saw you leaving. I'm sorry. He looked at her, his face a ruin of grief and self-loathing. Do whatever you want. Run. Take the horse. Kill me. I do not care. Just do not stop being kind to me. It was the most selfish, desperate plea, and he knew it. Clara sat there, rubbing her wrist. A raw, red chafe mark circled her skin. She looked at him, this massive, broken man, crying on the floor of his own bedroom. She looked at the chain. She looked at the open door. She took a long, shuddering breath. Then she stood up. Her legs were stiff. She pushed herself up, using the bedpost, the one she had been chained to, for support. Judson tensed, waiting. Would she run? Would she hit him? He deserved it. He deserved anything she chose to do. Clara May walked. She walked past the tray of food. She walked over the chain. She walked past him, her head high. She did not run. She walked out of the bedroom, down the hall, and into the kitchen. Judson followed her, stunned, his feet clumsy. She went to the sink and pumped water, washing her face, washing her wrist with a careful, steady hand. He stood in the doorway, a ghost in his own house, watching her. She went to the hearth, stoked the fire. She filled the kettle, set it on the hook. She took the loaf of bread she had baked the day before and a knife. She sliced 2 pieces, placed them on 2 plates. She found 2 mugs. She did all of this in a profound, deliberate silence. When the tea was steeped, she set the mugs on the table. She sat down, and she waited. Judson slowly, hesitantly, moved to the table. He did not sit in his chair. He stood, unsure, terrified. She looked up at him. Her eyes were not angry. They were not forgiving. They were something else. They were steady. That is once, she said, her voice a low rasp. The words hung in the air. He did not understand. Once what? She had not touched him. She just read to the empty chair. Sit, eat. He sat. He picked up the bread. It tasted like ash. She was reimposing her terms. He had broken her body, and she was answering with a ritual. It was the most profound act of defiance he had ever witnessed. The days that followed were a waking nightmare of tension. Judson moved his things to the bunkhouse. He did not sleep in the house. He could not. He gave her the entire house, his room, the bed he had defiled. He worked from before sunup until well after dark, driving himself to collapse. He did not touch her. He barely spoke to her. He left his apologies in the form of split firewood, full buckets of water, a brace of quail left on the kitchen steps. Clara did not leave. She spoke little. She cooked. She cleaned. She hummed her low lullabies on the porch. But something was different. She was no longer a guest. She was no longer a victim. She moved about the house with a quiet, certain ownership. He had locked her in, and in doing so, he had given her the keys. One evening, nearly a week later. He came back to the bunkhouse after dark, exhausted and covered in mud from repairing a break in the creek dam. She was there, sitting on his cot, a lantern lit beside her. He froze in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" "It is cold," she said simply. "The fire in the house is warm. You should sleep in your bed." "I cannot," he said, his voice rough. "Because of what you did?" He flinched. "Yes." "Then you are a coward," she said, not with malice, but with fact. "You are letting a memory chain you, just as you chained me." She stood up. She walked toward him. He backed away, but he was trapped in the doorway. "You are afraid of me," she said. "Yes," he admitted. She stood directly in front of him, so close he could smell the scent of sage on her skin. She looked up at his face, at the fear in his eyes. "Good," she said. She reached up, her small, chapped hands coming to rest on his shoulders. He was rigid, a statue of terrified muscle. She leaned in. She kissed him. It was not a forgiving kiss. It was not a passionate kiss. It was a kiss of intent. It was a kiss that said, "I am here. I am not broken. And I am still choosing." She pulled back. She looked him square in the eye. "Twice," she murmured. "That one word, that simple act, broke the last of his resistance. The shame, the fear, the loneliness. It all collapsed. He let out a breath he had been holding for a week. For 5 years. He reached for her, his hands shaking. He did not grab. He did not take it. His fingers gently touched her face, her hair. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. He did not know who moved first, but suddenly he was kissing her back, and it was not the desperate, angry kiss of before. This was slow. This was vulnerable. He picked her up. She weighed nothing. He carried her out of the bunkhouse, across the yard, and into the main house. He carried her into his bedroom, to the bed that was the site of his greatest sin. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice trembling. For an answer, she just reached up and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. They made love. It was slow and desperate and freighted with all the vulnerability of two ruined people. It was a clumsy act of grace. It was a search for comfort in a world that offered none. It was the taste of salt from her skin, the rasp of his beard, the creak of the iron bedstead. It was a mixture of profound pleasure, deep, aching grief, and a quiet, shuddering release. When it was over, they lay tangled in the sheets, the moonlight streaming in, painting her skin in silver. The house was silent. Judson turned his face away from her, toward the wall. His body began to shake. At first, she thought he was... She did not know what. Then she heard the sound, a low, guttural sob, torn from a place so deep inside him it had never seen the light. He was crying, not the hot, shameful tears of his apology, but the deep, racking sobs of a man who had been shattered and was only just now feeling the edges of his own pieces. Clara did not hesitate. She did not flinch from this raw, broken display. She moved. She rolled toward him, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders. She pulled his head, heavy with grief, onto her breast. She held him, her small body anchoring his large, trembling one. She stroked his hair, her own silent tears falling onto his head. She held him as he wept for Eliza, for his family, for the man he had killed, and for the man he had become. She just held him, in the bed where he had chained her, and let him break. The house settled into a new kind of silence. It was no longer the dead, hollow quiet of a tomb, but a fragile, breathing thing, like a skittish fawn that might bolt at a sudden sound. The morning after, Judson woke in his own bed, the sun streaming in. Clara was already gone, her side of the mattress cool. He found her in the kitchen, her back to him, kneading dough. Neither of them spoke of the night before, nor of the morning that had followed. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the shared vulnerability that was more terrifying to Judson than any gunfight. He did not go to the bunkhouse. He moved his few belongings back into the bedroom, placing his razor and his gun belt on the dresser. He found the heavy chain and the padlock on the floor where he had dropped them. He picked them up, the metal cold and obscene in his hands. He took them, not to the barn, but to the old, dry well behind the house, a dark pit that had not seen water in 20 years. He dropped the chain. He dropped the lock. He listened until the faint, metallic clatter echoed up from the blackness, and then he walked away. He began to work with a fury that was part penance and part a desperate need to build. He climbed onto the roof of the main house, a place that had been leaking for 3 winters, and he began to tear away the old, rotten shingles. He worked for days under the brutal sun, his hammer blows echoing across the valley. He was trying to prove, wordlessly, that he was a man who fixed things, not just one who broke them. When the roof was done, he moved to the southern pasture. The fence line had been down for a year. The posts rotted. The wire rusted and snapped. He dug post holes until his hands were raw and his bad shoulder screamed in protest. Clara watched him. She did not offer help with the heavy posts, but she brought him water in a tin dipper. She brought him bread and bacon at midday, and they would sit, not touching, in the thin shade of a lone juniper, the silence stretching between them. She had her own project, on the east side of the house, where the morning sun was gentle and the wind was broken by the porch. She began to turn the earth. The soil was hard, dry, and full of rocks. She used the spade, her small body straining, fighting the land. She was planting a garden. She had found a small tin of seeds in her trunk, thyme, sage, and mint. She was putting down roots, carving a small patch of life out of the dust. One afternoon, while Judson was stretching wire, he heard a sharp cry. He dropped the pliers and ran, his heart seizing. Visions of rattlesnakes flashing in his mind. He found her by the pump, soaked from head to toe. The handle, she said, sputtering, pointing at the pump. It stuck, and then it came free. She was drenched. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her thin dress clung to her body. Judson stopped, his breath catching. He looked at her, at the water dripping from her nose. He had been so tense, so ready for violence, that the sight of her, so ridiculous and so mundane, broke something in him. He expected her to be angry or embarrassed, but she just looked at him, her lips pressed together, and then a small, sputtering giggle escaped her. She swiped the wet hair from her eyes. "I must look frightened," she said. "You do," he agreed. She laughed then, a real laugh, bright and clear as the water she was covered in. The sound was so foreign in that place, so unexpected, that Judson just stared at her. "Well," she said, a challenge in her eyes, "are you just going to stand there, or are you going to help me prime this thing?" He moved to the pump, and as he passed her, a short, rusty sound rumbled up from his own chest. It was a bark, a cough. He had not laughed in 5 years, and he had forgotten how. It surprised them both. And in that shared awkward moment, the fragile, breathing silence in the house finally settled. It decided to stay. They shared chores. They fell into a rhythm. He would split the wood. She would carry it. She would cook. He would clean the pan. They worked in silence, sometimes. But it was a comfortable silence now. The silence of 2 people working in tandem, a team. The nights were different. 2. His nightmares did not stop. But when he woke, gasping and sweating, the smell of smoke and blood in his nostrils, he was not alone. He would feel a small hand on his arm, a quiet presence beside him in the dark. Clara would not coddle him. She would not whisper platitudes. She would simply say, "You are here, Judson. It is just the wind." And he would lie back down, and the ghosts would recede, held at bay by the simple, solid fact of her. One evening, he was in the kitchen, carefully cleaning his rifle, the pieces laid out on an oilcloth on the table. It was a ritual, a comfort, the familiar feel of the steel and wood. Clara was sitting by the fire, mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "The blue thread," she said, her head bent. "I cannot find it. I believe it is in the sewing box on the high shelf." Judson nodded, not looking up. I will get it in a moment. Please, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Hold this steady. Husband? He froze. The rifle barrel in his hands suddenly felt slick. He looked up slowly. She had not raised her head. She was holding the torn shirt. Waiting. What? What did you call me? He said, his voice a low rasp. She finally looked up. Her gaze was level, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. I called you husband. Is that not what you are? Clara, we ain't married. There was no preacher. There was a storm, she interrupted, her voice soft. And a promise. And there was a chain. And then there was this. I am your wife, Judson. And you are my husband. In this house. To this land. That is what we are. She was not asking him. She was telling him. She was rewriting the terms of their bargain, not as a duty for survival, but as a simple, unadorned fact. He was confused. The word, husband. He had thought it was a word buried on the hill with Eliza. He had thought it was a word that could never apply to him, the killer, the madman. But hearing it from Clara's lips, it did not sound like a condemnation. It sounded like a statement, like, the sky is blue, or the fire is hot. It softened a part of him he thought was long dead. He stood, his joints cracking, and fetched the sewing box. He placed it in her hands. He did not say anything, but when he returned to his rifle, the gun felt heavier, and the cold, hard lines of his world seemed a little less certain. The fragile peace was broken by the sound of a wagon. Judson was in the barn, re-shoeing the mare. When he heard the rumble of wheels and the jingle of harness, he was instantly on edge. He grabbed his rifle from the hook and stepped out. Squinting into the bright afternoon sun, a battered supply wagon, pulled by two tired mules, was rolling to a stop in his yard. The man at the reins was Jedediah Potts, a trader who ran supplies out to the remote ranches. Potts was a drunk, a gossip, and a man Judson had actively avoided for 2 years. Well now, hail! Potts boomed, his voice falsely cheerful. He was a large, unkempt man with a tobacco-stained beard. Long time, no see. Thought maybe the coyotes had got you. Judson stood his ground, the rifle held loosely at his side. State your business. Potts. Business. Always business with you. Hail. Potts wrapped the reins and heaved himself down from the wagon, landing with a grunt. He smelled of sour whiskey and old sweat. Just making my rounds. Got powder, got shot, got flour from the new mill, got some ladies' fripperies too? He winked, a grotesque gesture. It was then that the kitchen door opened. Clara stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the sun. Judson, is everything... She stopped. She saw Potts. Potts saw her. The trader's jaw went slack. He stared, his eyes traveling over her, from her worn dress to her bare feet. His wet-lipped, appreciative gaze was a physical insult. Well, hello, Potts said, his voice dropping. Hail, you old dog. You've been holding out on us. Judson stepped forward, his body rigid. She's my wife. Potts, what do you want? Potts threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Wife, that's a good one. Since when does Judson Hale take a wife? Heard the stage left a passenger out here a few weeks back, a little dark-haired thing in a widow's dress. Seems she found very comfortable shelter. The insinuation was thick and foul. He was calling her a whore. Get your wagon off my land, Judson said, his voice deadly quiet. Now, hold on, Potts said, though he took a step back. I'm just being neighborly. The town's gonna be mighty interested to hear about your... Wife might be interested. I need 10 pounds of flour and a box of shells, Judson said, his teeth gritted. Leave it on the porch. The money is on the barrel. He walked back to the barn, the rifle still in his hand. He did not watch Potts go. He listened. He heard the scrape of the flour sack, the clink of coins. He heard the wagon creak as Potts mounted. You have a good day now, Mrs. Hale, Potts shouted, the name a mockery. The whip cracked. and the wagon rumbled away. Judson slammed his fist into a support beam. The wood shuddered. The damage was done. By nightfall, the entire town of San Mateo would know. He went into the house. Clara was standing by the table, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. "Clara," he said. "I heard." "Next time," he said, his voice rough with a fear he hated. "Next time you hear a rider, you go to the bedroom. You go to the root cellar. You stay out of sight." She turned. Her face was not tearful. It was pale, and it was hard. "No." The refusal stunned him. "What? Did you hear what he said? Did you hear what he called you? I am trying to protect you." "By hiding me?" she said, her voice shaking with a quiet, cold fury. "Is that how you protect me? Judson, you want to hide me in the cellar, like rotten potatoes? Is that different from the chain?" The words hit him like a physical blow. He reeled back. It was the same. It was the same fear, the same impulse to control, to lock away. "Clara, this ain't Tennessee," he pleaded, his voice desperate. "These are hard men. They'll talk. They'll come." "They called me a servant in my own home," she said, her voice rising. "They called me a jinx, a widow with bad luck. Now I'm a whore. It is just a word. It is a word men like Mr. Potts used to keep women hidden, or to justify taking what they want." She stepped toward him, jabbing a finger at his chest. "I am done hiding. You told me I was free. You gave me that. You cannot take it back now because you are scared. I am not." "You are," she cut him off. "You are terrified. Not of them, of what they'll say, of losing me. But you will lose me faster if you try to put me in a cage again. I told you I was free, and that means I do not hide. Let them talk." She turned her back on him, went to the flour sack Potts had left, and plunged her hands into it, her movements angry and decisive. The argument was over. He was checkmated. She was right. He had unlocked her, but he was still a prisoner. He retreated to the porch, his world tilting. He had wanted to protect her, but she had just protected herself from him. The real trouble came 3 days later. It was just after dawn. Judson was on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sun paint the cliffs. He saw the dust first. 3 riders. They were not moving like Potts. They were moving slowly, deliberately, their horses fresh. They were not traders. They were armed for a fight. His blood ran cold. He went inside. Clara was by the stove. "Go to the bedroom," he said, his voice flat, all emotion drained. "Bar the door. Do not, no matter what you hear, do not come out." She looked at his face, the hardness there, the old cold mask he used to wear. This was not Potts. This was not gossip. This was death. She did not argue. She just nodded, her face white. "Judson, go!" She ran to the bedroom. He heard the heavy oaken bar slide into place. Judson took his rifle from the wall. He checked the load. He stepped out onto the porch, not in the shadows, but in the full, open light. He waited. The 3 riders stopped just outside his fence line. They sat their horses, 3 dark shapes against the rising sun. They were all young. The one in the middle, on a tall black gelding, was dressed in a way that aped style. With a new hat and a silver concho belt, he had a cruel, familiar mouth. "Judson Hale," the middle rider called. "Who's asking?" Judson replied, his voice calm, carrying on the still morning air. "My name is Ethan Dugan." The name hit Judson like a punch to the gut. "Dugan, I had a brother," Ethan Dugan continued, his voice conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Micah, you murdered him." "Your brother shot first," Judson said, his hands tight on the rifle. "He killed an unarmed woman. He killed Hale." Ethan sneered. "That's all that matters. Our father, he died last month, drank himself into the grave, cursing your name. He said you ruined him. Now, the land, it's ours, and we're here to renegotiate the boundaries." Judson said nothing. "We see this ranch as payment for Micah, for our father. We call it justice." Ethan smiled. A thin, ugly expression that was all Micah. "You have 24 hours. Clear out. Surrender the ranch, the stock, everything. We might even let you live. And if I don't, then we'll burn you out," Ethan said simply. "We'll be back at dawn tomorrow. Be gone. Hail." He turned his horse, slow, arrogant. The three riders trotted away, disappearing back into the dust they had come from. Judson stood there for a long time. The past, the blood, the bill he thought he had paid, had finally come due. He went inside. He unbarred the bedroom door. Clara was sitting on the bed, her hands twisting in her lap. "Who was that?" she whispered. "The past," he said. He sat on the bed next to her, a move that felt strangely domestic in the face of annihilation. He told her. About Eliza, about the feud, about killing Micah Duggan. He told her everything. When he was finished, she was silent. He expected her to be horrified. He expected her to be repulsed. She just nodded. "We have to leave," she said, her voice practical, firm. "We can pack the trunk. We have 2 good horses. We can be in Arizona territory in a week. We can go to California. We can disappear." It was her solution, the one she had used her whole life. Run. Disappear. Judson looked at her. He looked at her small, determined face. He looked at the garden she had planted outside the window. He looked at the mended shirt on the chair. "No," he said. "Judson," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "This is not a fight. This is an execution. There are 3. You are 1. This isn't bravery. It's suicide. For what? This dirt? This broken-down house?" He put his hand over hers. Her skin was warm. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "Not for the house?" He looked her in the eyes. "I have been running for 5 years. Clara, I've been hiding in this house, hiding in a bottle, hiding from what I did. I won't run anymore." "But they will kill you." "Then they will kill me. But I will not run. This is my home. You are here." The decision was made. He was no longer the man who ran. He was the man who stayed. That night was the longest of his life. He did not board the windows. That was a fool's game. He checked his rifles. He had the Winchester. He had his old Sharps buffalo rifle. He had his service revolver. He laid out the shells, the powder, the oil. The kitchen table looked like a gunsmith's bench. Clara did not argue with him again. She saw the set of his jaw. She made coffee, so thick and black it was like syrup. She made bread. Her movements were jerky, her hands shaking. But she was there. She was not running. The silence was deafening, thick with what was coming at dawn. He stopped his work. He looked at her, standing by the stove, her silhouette cast long and thin by the lamplight. She looked small and breakable, and more courageous than any man he had ever known. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her. "You should have run," he whispered. "So should you." She whispered back. He kissed her. It was not the slow, healing kiss of their nights together. It was not the desperate, sobbing kiss of his apology. It was a kiss of fury. It was a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and fear and a desperate, clawing need to be alive. He was angry. He was terrified. He was alive, more alive than he had been in years, and he was about to lose it all. He picked her up, his arms like steel bands, and carried her to the bedroom. He did not lay her down gently. He threw her on the bed, and his body covered hers, his mouth never leaving hers. They made love with a ferocity that bordered on violence. It was a fight. It was an argument. It was 2 people, angry and afraid, scratching and biting and clawing at each other, trying to get closer than skin, trying to mark each other in a way that death could not erase. She met his anger with her own, her fingernails raking his back, her teeth finding his shoulder. She bit him, hard, and he felt the sharp, electric thrill of it. After, they lay tangled in the sheets, slick with sweat, their chests heaving, listening to the wind, which sounded like a woman wailing. He lay on his back, his body rigid, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the first hint of gray in the window. She moved. She pressed her small, warm body against his side, laying her head on his chest, over his heart. He could feel her tears, hot and wet, soaking the hair on his chest. She was crying, not with the noise, but with deep, silent shudders. He heard her take a ragged breath. She whispered against his skin, her voice broken and thick with tears. 3. He closed his eyes. The word was an anchor in the black, rushing tide. It was not a duty. It was not a promise. It was everything. It was a period at the end of a sentence he had not known how to finish. He wrapped his arm around her, his muscles aching, his body scarred by her nails. He pulled her tight, his hand gripping her shoulder, and he waited for the dawn. The gray light of dawn was not a beginning, but an end. It was a cold, sterile illumination that stole the color from the world, leaving only shadow and grit. Judson stood at the window, his rifle in his hand, his body humming with a terrible, vibrating tension. He had not slept. Clara was beside him, dressed, her face a pale oval in the gloom. The attack did not come with the thunder of hooves or the boom of rifles. It came with the color red, a bloom of orange, far off, on the horizon of the south pasture. "What is that?" Clara whispered, her hand gripping his arm. Judson squinted. It was not the sun. It was too low, too fast. It was on fire. "They're burning the grass," he said, his voice flat and dead. "The dry grass. They're running the cattle." He was moving before he finished the sentence. Not for his guns, but for the door. "The horses. Now." "What? Judson! No! It's them! It's the herd!" "Clara!" he roared, grabbing her by the arm. "It's everything we have. It's a grass fire. They mean to stampede them, or burn them alive." This was a different kind of warfare. Not a frontal assault, but a strangulation. To kill the ranch. You killed the stock. He dragged her to the barn, his mind racing. The horses were already skittish, smelling the smoke on the wind. He threw a bridle on the mare, another on his gelding. "Ride to the West Canyon," he ordered, throwing her into the saddle. "Get low, get behind the herd, turn them north. I'll take the east flank. We have to circle them. Yell till your throat bleeds. Judson, it's a trap," she cried, her hands twisting in the reins. "It's a fire," he yelled back, "and they are burning us alive. Now, ride." He slapped the mare's rump, and the horse leaped forward. He mounted his own and galloped into the dawn, the acrid smell of smoke filling his lungs. They rode into hell. The fire was moving fast, a crackling, snapping wall of flame devouring the parched landscape. The cattle were bawling, a sound of mass terror, running blindly from the smoke. Judson and Clara were two small figures against an inferno, screaming themselves hoarse, riding through the choking, blinding smoke. They were not husband and wife. They were not lovers. They were partners, fighting a single, monstrous beast. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of terror and exhaustion. But they did it. They turned the herd. They pushed the panicked, soot-covered animals into the safety of the wide, rocky creek bed, where the fire could not follow. They sat their horses, their chests heaving, their faces black with soot. They had saved most of them. And then Judson looked back toward the house. A different column of smoke was rising, a thick, black, greasy plume. It was not the clean, fast smoke of burning grass. It was the smoke of pine and hay. "No," he whispered. "Judson?" Clara's voice was a thin thread of fear. He did not answer. He kicked his horse, already exhausted, into a desperate, lung-bursting run. He knew what it was before he saw it. The barn. They had been tricked. The fire in the pasture was a diversion, a way to draw them out, to leave the heart of the ranch undefended. He crested the rise. The barn was a roaring tower of flame, the roof already collapsing inward. The horses he had left inside, the 2 old geldings, were screaming. It was a sound Judson would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. Ethan Dugan and his men were there. They were sitting on their horses, just outside the range of the heat, watching it burn. They were laughing when they saw Judson, Ethan Dugan raised his hat in a mock salute. "Morning, Hale," he shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of the flames. "Just cleaning up the place for you." Judson let out a sound. It was not human. It was a primal scream of rage and grief. He dropped the reins and raised his rifle, firing from the saddle, a wild, unaimed shot. The Duggans just laughed. They were not there to fight. Not yet. They were there to wound. Ethan blew a mocking kiss toward Clara, who had ridden up beside Judson, her face a mask of white horror. "We'll be back in the house," Ethan called. "And for the pretty new wife." They wheeled their horses and galloped away, their laughter mixing with the screams of the dying animals. Judson slid from his horse. He walked toward the inferno, his rifle hanging limply at his side. He was numb. The fire was so hot it seared his eyebrows. The barn, the one his father had built with his own hands, was gone. The horses were silent now. He just stood there, watching his world turn to ash. Clara came and stood beside him. She did not touch him. She just stood there, a silent witness, when the roof caved in completely, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. Judson turned. He walked, not to the house, but to the water trough. He plunged his head into the cold water, washing the soot from his face. When he emerged, his eyes were clear, and they were the color of stone. He walked back to the house. He strode into the kitchen, where the table was still covered in his weapons. He ignored the sharps. That was a long-range rifle. This was close. He strapped his gun belt on, the weight of the revolver familiar and comforting. He picked up the Winchester. He began to check the loads again, one by one, his movements methodical, clean. Clara followed him. "Judson, what are you doing?" "What I should have done last night," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're riding to town, to the saloon, to brag. I'm going to meet them there." "No!" She grabbed his arm, the one holding the rifle. "Judson, no, you cannot. That is murder." "That was justice," he snarled, nodding toward the smoldering ruins. "What they did. This is just pest control." "Judson, listen to me," she begged, her voice frantic. She was crying now, the tears cutting clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. "It is just a building. It is just wood. We are alive. The cattle are alive. We can rebuild. We can leave." "I am done running," he said, and he tried to pull his arm from her grasp. "This is not running. This is living," she screamed at him. "Do not go back to violence. Please, Judson, do not let them make you a killer again. For me, please, do not do this to me." "They will be back, Clara," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "They said it. They will be back in the house. They will be back for you. I have to end this. We will end it together. Not like this. Not in a saloon. Like a common butcher. There is no other way." He gently, but firmly, pried her fingers from his arm. He turned to the door. This was it. He was going to walk out, and he was not going to come back until he or the Duggans were on the ground. "I am pregnant." The words were a whisper. He stopped, his hand on the door latch. The world, the roar of the fire, the pounding in his head, it all went silent. "What?" he said, his back still to her. I am with child," she said, her voice shaking, but growing stronger. "I am pregnant. Judson, it is yours. I think, 2, maybe 3 months. I was not sure. Until this morning." He turned slowly. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen, her hands crossed over her flat stomach. She was terrified. She was not just telling him, she was using it. It was the only weapon she had left. Judson stared at her belly, a child, a life. Here, in this hell. He looked at the rifle in his hand. He looked at the gun on his hip. He looked at the ashes drifting past the window. A child. His child. He fell to his knees. The rifle clattered to the floor. He did not fall like a man in prayer. He fell like a man whose legs had been cut out from under him. He dropped his head. his hands covering his face. "God," he whispered, the word a choked, broken sound. "Oh, God, forgive me." He was not asking forgiveness for the Duggins. He was asking forgiveness for this, for bringing a new, innocent life into his cycle of blood and ash, for being a man who was about to make his child fatherless before it was even born. Clara was at his side in an instant, her arms around his head, pulling him against her. He was kneeling, and she was standing, and he was clinging to her waist, his face pressed against her stomach, against the new, impossible life hidden there. "It is all right," she whispered, her hands stroking his hair, though she was the one trembling. "It is all right. Husband?" "No," he mumbled to her. "No, it is not." He stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the kitchen floor, holding his wife. The rage was gone, scoured out of him, replaced by a vast, cold, and primal fear. It was not his own life he was afraid of losing anymore. "They will be back," he said finally, his voice muffled. "I know," she said. He pulled back, his hand still on her waist. He looked up at her. "They will be back, tonight or tomorrow. They will come to finish the job. Then we will not be here," she said. "We will not run," he said, his voice hard. "We will not run." She agreed. He stood. He picked up the rifle, but it felt different in his hands. It was not a tool of vengeance. It was a tool of defense. "The North Ravine," he said, his mind working now, cold and clear. "There's a rocky pass. It's the only other way to the house. It's narrow. We can stop them there, or we can make them think they can trap us there." They worked all afternoon. They did not board the house. They made it look as if they had fled. They took the horses, the remaining cattle, and pushed them deep into the arroyo. Then they went to the pass. It was a narrow cut in the rock, barely wide enough for a wagon. Judson stacked rocks, building a small, defensible blind. He had the sharps. He had the Winchester. He had water. Clara was with him. "I can load," she said. "You will stay behind this rock," he ordered. "And you will not make a sound." They waited. The sun went down. The high desert chill set in. The moon rose, bathing the rocks in a pale, ghostly light. They came just before dawn. They came just as Judson knew they would. They were not subtle. They were arrogant, drunk on their earlier victory. They rode their horses hard, making noise, their voices echoing in the pass. "Come out, Hale!" Ethan Dugan's voice boomed. "We'll make it quick." They saw the house was dark. They saw the horses were gone. "He ran," one of the men laughed. "The coward ran." "He didn't run far," Ethan said. "The cattle are in the arroyo. He's up here. He's in the past. He's trapped. Flush him out." They dismounted. They were coming on foot, 3 of them. Judson rested the heavy barrel of the sharps on the rock. He waited. He controlled his breathing. He was not a killer. He was a husband. He was a father. "Now," he whispered. The first shadow moved between the rocks. Judson aimed. He did not aim for the head. He aimed for the ground, just in front of him. He fired. The blast from the buffalo rifle was deafening. It was not a gunshot. It was a cannon. The bullet struck the granite, exploding in a shower of sparks and rock fragments. The man screamed, clutching his face, as the shrapnel tore into him. "He's here!" Ethan yelled. Judson fired again, with the Winchester this time, another ricochet. He was not trying to kill them. He was trying to stop them. "Spread out!" Ethan roared. It was chaos. They were firing blind, their bullets smacking the rocks around him. One of the men, the one hit by the shrapnel, was screaming. "I'm hit! Ethan, I'm hit!" "Shut up!" Ethan snarled. He was moving, flanking, coming up the left side. Judson saw him. He saw the glint of the moonlight on a pistol barrel. He raised the Winchester. "Judson, look out!" Clara screamed. The third man. He had come from the right. He was above them. He stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the pale sky, and he leveled his rifle right at Judson. Judson fired. The man on the ridge fired. Both shots echoed as one. Judson felt it. A white-hot, tearing pain in his side. It was not a punch. It was a fire. It spun him around, slamming him into the rock wall. He slid down, the rifle clattering from his hands. The man on the ridge stood there for a second. Then he toppled forward, his rifle dropping, and he slid down the rocks, landing in a heap, unmoving. "Caleb!" Ethan Dugan screamed. He saw his man fall. He saw Judson go down. He panicked. One man was down, presumed dead. The other was screaming, blind. Ethan was a bully, not a soldier. He fired 2 more wild shots toward Judson's position. Then he turned and ran. He ran back to the horses, scrambling, falling. Judson heard him grab the screaming man. He heard the horses galloping away, a frantic, terrified sound, fading into the distance. Then there was silence, only the wind, and the sound of the man below, moaning. "Clara!" Judson gasped. The pain was immense. He was wet. He looked down. His hand was covered in blood. "I'm here." She was at his side, her hands fluttering. "Oh, God! Oh, Judson! The other one?" he panted. "The one on the rocks." "He's dead," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Good," he sagged. Help me up." They did not go to the house. They stumbled, him leaning on her, back to the barn. The ruins were still smoldering, radiating a dull, comforting heat against the pre-dawn chill. She tore his shirt open. The wound was in his side, high on his ribs. It was bleeding. A lot. "It went through," she said, her voice shaking, but her hands were already moving, tearing her own petticoat into strips. "Oh, God, it went through. That's good," he gasped, his teeth chattering. She had her sewing kit from her trunk, the one she had used to mend his shirt. She threaded a needle in the dim, gray light. "Boil it," he said. "There's no time," she said. She uncorked the small bottle of whiskey he had brought. She poured it over the needle, and then she poured the rest of it onto his wound. He screamed, a high, strangled sound, and he bit down on a piece of leather she shoved in his mouth. She stitched his wound in the ruins of his barn, surrounded by the smell of ash and blood, with the dawn breaking over the mountains. Clara May stitched her husband's body back together. Her face was a mask of concentration, her small hands moving with a purpose that was both terrifying and beautiful. When she was done, she wrapped the bandage tight, so tight he could barely breathe. He was pale, shaking, covered in a cold sweat. He lay back, his head resting on a charred beam. He looked at her. Her face was streaked with soot and his blood. "I was so afraid," he whispered, the words costing him. "We are safe, Judson." "No." He reached out, his hand finding hers. Not of them. Afraid of losing you." He looked at her, his eyes clear and dark with a pain that was not from the wound. You and the baby." Clara's face crumpled. She brought his bloody, grimy hand to her cheek. "Then you better listen to me, Judson Hale," she whispered, her voice thick. "You are not allowed to die. You better love me 3 times a day, every day. You promised." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. A hard bargain. Wife. The hardest." She agreed. Winter was coming. The first snows dusted the high peaks, but the ranch was not dead. They rebuilt. Judson was weak, his side a constant, nagging pain, but he worked, he limped. He taught Clara how to mix mud and straw for the adobe. They were not rebuilding the grand barn. They were building a smaller, stronger, smarter structure. Clara was different. She was not the pale, terrified widow. She was not the defiant, bartering survivor. She was the matriarch of the ranch. She hung laundry, her belly just beginning to show a small, gentle curve, and she hummed. Her low, sad lullabies were gone, replaced by hymns and dance hall tunes she must have heard somewhere. She was humming. Deason would stop his work, listening, and the sound of it, the simple, mundane joy of it, would fill the holes in him. One evening, they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the early, purple sunset. "If it's a boy," Judson said, his voice quiet, "we'll name him after my father, Elias." Clara looked at him. Her dead husband's name. "No," she said gently. "Your father was John. We will name him John. Or maybe Micah." Judson looked at her, stunned. "A new Micah," she said. "A good one." Judson thought about it. He nodded. "And if it's a girl?" Clara smiled, a small, secret smile. "I was thinking Hope or Faith." "No," Judson said, a grin touching his own lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "If it's a girl, I want her to be as mean as you." She laughed and punched him in his good shoulder. Later that night, he filled the horse trough with water heated on the stove. The stars were brilliant, thick as spilled salt. In the cold, black sky, they bathed together. The water was hot, the steam rising around them. He was awkward, his wound pulling. She washed his back, her hands gentle over the old scars, over the new stitches. He turned, facing her. He looked at her body, the small, proud swell of her stomach. He leaned down, his lips moving through the water, and he kissed her belly. He kissed the life inside. Clara's hands came up. She cupped his face. He was all scars and angles and hard, worn lines. She leaned forward. She did not kiss his lips. She kissed the puckered, ugly bullet scar on his shoulder. She kissed the scar on his chest. She kissed the man who had been broken, and who was, piece by piece, being made whole. The first snow did not drift down gently. It arrived with the violence of a hammer blow. It was November, early for the high country, but the sky turned the color of a bruised plum in the middle of the afternoon, and the temperature plummeted until the very air seemed to snap and hiss. By nightfall, the wind was shrieking down the canyon, driving ice crystals that cut like glass. Inside the rebuilt house, the world was shrunk down to the circle of light cast by the kerosene lamp and the radius of heat from the iron stove. Clara sat in the rocking chair Judson had repaired for her, a heavy quilt tucked around her legs. She was 7 months along now, her belly a high, firm mound beneath her dress. She had been humming earlier, a tune about a river in the moonlight, but the humming had stopped an hour ago. Judson was cleaning his revolver at the table, a habit that had become more meditation than maintenance. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was restless. She shifted in the chair, wincing, her hand going to her lower back. "Is the fire too hot?" he asked, setting the gun cloth down. "No," she said. Her voice was tight. "It is the wind. It makes the baby jump." She lied. He knew she lied. He saw the way her knuckles turned white where she gripped the armrest. He stood up, abandoning the gun, and walked to her. He placed his hand on her stomach. The child was indeed moving, but there was a rigid tightness to her muscles that felt wrong. "Clara," he said, his voice low. She looked up at him, and her eyes were wide, dark pools of fear. "It hurts, Judson. It is squeezing. Low down. It comes and goes." Judson felt the blood drain from his face. He knew cattle. He knew horses. He knew that when a mare started straining 2 months early, the foal usually did not survive, and often neither did the mother. "It's too soon," he whispered. "I know," she gasped, and then her face contorted. She doubled over, a sharp, guttural sound escaping her throat. "Oh, God, it hurts." The wind howled outside, a demonic chorus battering the adobe walls. The snow was already drifting 2 feet high against the door. Judson moved. He scooped her up from the chair. She was heavier now, solid with life, but he lifted her as if she were made of feathers. He carried her to the bed, tucking the quilts around her. "Stay warm," he ordered. "Do not move." "Where are you going?" She gripped his wrist, her fingernails digging in. "Judson, do not go out there. You will die in this." "I'm going to get Mrs. Gable," he said. Mrs. Gable was a midwife who lived in a small settlement near the old mine, 8 miles to the east. 8 miles in a blizzard was a death sentence for a fool, for a desperate man. It was a necessity. "No," Clara cried, pulling at him. "You cannot. The drifts. The horse. Judson, please, stay with me. If I lose it, I cannot be alone." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. His lips were cold, his face set in lines of granite. "You will not lose it, and I will not lose you. I am too selfish to let you go. Clara May, I will be back." He pulled away, grabbing his heavy buffalo coat, his hat, and a coil of rope. He went out into the white blindness. The barn was warmer than the outside, but not by much. The mare, Lady, whinnied nervously as he entered. She smelled the storm and his anxiety. He saddled her in the dark, his fingers numb and clumsy on the buckles. He did not take the saddlebags. He needed speed. He mounted inside the barn and rode out into the teeth of the gale. The wind hit him like a physical solid. It tore the breath from his lungs and blinded him instantly. There was no road. There was no sky. There was only swirling white chaos. He bowed his head, burying his face in the horse's mane, trusting the animal's instincts more than his own. "Go on, girl," he yelled, though the wind snatched the words away before they left his lips. "Find the way." The journey was a blur of freezing misery. Twice, the mare stumbled in a drift that came up to her chest, and Judson had to dismount, slogging through the snow to lead her, his legs burning, his bad shoulder aching with a deep, throbbing rhythm. He lost all sense of time. It might have been an hour. It might have been a week. He navigated by the slope of the land and the feel of the wind on his left cheek. He thought of Clara. He thought of the chain he had once used to bind her. Now, he was bound to her by something far stronger and more terrifying. If she died, if the child died, the silence that would descend on the ranch would not just be quiet, it would be the end of the world. He saw the light of the settlement only when he was nearly upon it, a faint, yellow smudge in the gray swirling void. He rode the exhausted horse right up to the porch of the small cabin and hammered on the door with a frozen fist. Mrs. Gable opened it, holding a lantern high. She was a woman built of gristle and iron, with gray hair braided tight against her skull. She took one look at Judson, a snowman with wild eyes, and knew. "Who is it?" she barked. "Hale," he rasped. "My wife. The baby. It's coming. It's too soon." Mrs. Gable did not ask questions. She did not complain about the weather. She turned back into the room. "Saddle my mule. I'll get my bag." The ride back was slower. The midwife rode her mule, wrapped in blankets like a bundle of goods, following close in the track broken by Judson's mare. The storm raged on, indifferent to their urgency. Judson felt his strength fading. His hands were frozen claws. He kept himself awake by reciting the names he and Clara had discussed. John, Micah, Hope, Faith. When they finally saw the dark outline of the ranch house, Judson nearly wept with relief. He stabled the animals, not bothering to unsaddle them yet, just throwing blankets over their steaming backs, and ran for the house. Inside, the fire had burned low. Clara was curled on her side, moaning softly. Mrs. Gable pushed past him, throwing off her coat. She was all business now. She checked Clara, her hands swift and sure. She boiled water. She brewed a vile-smelling tea from herbs she pulled from her bag, black haw and cramp bark. "Make her drink this." "Mrs." Gable ordered Judson. "It tastes like mud, but it will stop the contractions if God wills it." Judson sat on the edge of the bed. He lifted Clara's head. She was barely conscious, her face gray and beaded with sweat. "Drink, Clara," he whispered. "Drink for me." She gagged, but she swallowed. The night was a vigil. Mrs. Gable sat by the fire, smoking a pipe, watching. Judson sat by the bed, holding Clara's hand, measuring her every breath. Slowly, agonizingly. The tea worked. The cramping eased. Clara's breathing deepened into sleep. The storm outside began to howl with less fury, as if recognizing it had lost the contest. Judson did not sleep. He watched the rise and fall of her chest until the gray light of morning crept across the floorboards. Clara survived, and so did the child. But the near disaster left her frail. For 2 weeks, she could not leave the bed. The doctor in her was gone, replaced by a pale, fragile woman who needed help to sit up. Judson Hale, the man who had once lived like a hermit wolf, became a nurse. He cooked. He made broths from the beef he slaughtered, skimming the fat with painstaking care. He baked bread, though his loaves were heavy and lopsided compared to hers. He washed the sheets, boiling them in the copper tub and hanging them by the fire to dry because it was too cold outside. He washed her every morning and every evening. He brought a basin of warm water to the bedside. He sponged her face, her arms, her growing belly. He combed the tangles from her long, dark hair, his large, calloused fingers moving with a gentleness that belied their strength. "You are doing too much," she whispered one evening as he fed her spoonfuls of soup. "I am doing what is needed," he said. "The cattle can eat snow for all I care," he said, scraping the bowl. "You eat this." He saw the way she looked at him. It was not just gratitude. It was a deep, abiding recognition. He was not just the man who protected her with a gun. He was the man who sustained her with a spoon. One night, he sat in the rocking chair, watching her sleep. The fear of losing her had settled into a permanent ache in his chest. But it was a good ache. It meant he had something to lose. He realized then that the ranch, the land, the vengeance, none of it mattered. If the house burned down tomorrow, he would build a lean-to. As long as she was in it, it was a home. Winter eventually lost its grip. The snow receded, revealing the brown, wet earth. The creek swelled with meltwater, singing a loud, rushing song. With the thaw came the news. The story of the fight in the past, of the burning of the barn, and of Judson Hale standing alone against the Duggan clan had traveled. It had been embellished, as Western stories always are, in the retelling. Judson had not just held the pass. He had been a demon of vengeance, invincible and righteous. The townsfolk of San Mateo, who had once whispered that he was a madman who talked to ghosts, now spoke of him with a grudging, fearful respect. He was no longer the crazy hermit. He was the hard man who had driven out the bullies. One crisp March morning, a wagon rattled up the muddy track to the ranch. It was not Jedediah Potts. It was a man Judson did not know, a younger man with a face full of freckles and a nervous smile. Judson walked out to meet him, not with a rifle, but with a pitchfork he had been using to clear the debris of the old barn. "Morning, Mr. Hale," the man called out. "Name's Amos Vance. Bought the spread 2 valleys over, the old Miller place." "I know it," Judson said, leaning on the fork. "Bad water in the summer?" "That's what I hear," Amos said, shifting on the seat. I heard about your barn, and the trouble. Just wanted to say, the Duggans tried to levy a tax on my crossing last year. I'm glad they're gone. You did the territory a service." Judson nodded once. "They won't be back." "I brought some seed corn," Amos said, gesturing to the back of the wagon. "Heard you might be short, what with the fire, and I got a sack of early potatoes. My wife, well, she sent a jar of peach preserves for your missus. Heard she was in a family way." Judson looked at the man. A year ago, he would have told him to turn around and get off his land. Now, he thought of the empty pantry and Clara's craving for something sweet. "I don't take charity," Judson said. "It ain't charity," Amos said quickly. "I need a bull. Heard you have a good Hereford line. Maybe we can trade." Seed for a season of breeding rights? It was a fair trade, more than fair. It was an offering of civilization. "Pull around to the corral," Judson said. When Amos left an hour later, Judson walked into the house carrying the jar of preserves. Clara was sitting up in the chair, looking stronger. "Who was that?" she asked. "Neighbor," Judson said, setting the jar on the table. "Brought you peaches." Clara looked at the jar, the amber fruit catching the light. Tears welled in her eyes. It was the first kindness from the outside world she had received since stepping off the stagecoach. "Peaches?" she whispered. 2 weeks later, Judson hitched the team to the wagon. "Get your coat," he said to Clara. "Where are we going?" "Town. You need fabric for the baby. And I need nails." She hesitated. "Judson. Mr. Potts. The rumors." "Let them look," Judson said, helping her up to the seat. "You are Mrs. Judson Hale. You walk with your head up. If anyone has a word to say, they can say it to me." The ride to San Mateo was quiet. Clara gripped his hand the entire way. When they rolled down the main street, heads turned. Men stopped their whittling on the boardwalks. Women paused in their sweeping. They pulled up in front of the general store. Judson helped her down. He did not hurry. He adjusted her shawl. His touch proprietary and tender. He offered her his arm. They walked in. The store smelled of coffee beans and sawdust. Jedediah Potts was behind the counter. When he saw Judson, he went pale. He looked at Clara, then at Judson's hip, where the revolver sat. "Mr. Hale," Potts stammered. "Mrs. Hale." He used her title. He said it clearly. "Potts," Judson nodded. "We need flannel. White and soft." The store was not empty. There were other women there, wives of ranchers and miners. They watched. Clara felt their eyes. She stiffened, lifting her chin. One woman, an older matron with a severe bonnet, stepped forward. Clara braced herself for a snub. "The flannel is in the back, dear," the woman said. Her voice was not warm, but it was not cruel. "The good bolt. Make sure he doesn't sell you the thin stuff he keeps on the shelf." Clara blinked. "Thank you. And," the woman added, glancing at Clara's belly, "drink raspberry leaf tea. It helps with the labor." Clara smiled, a tentative, fragile thing. "I will. Thank you." They left the store an hour later. The wagon loaded. No one had jeered. No one had whispered, at least not loud enough to be heard. Judson helped her up, and as he walked around to the other side, a man on the boardwalk touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Hale?" "Morning," Judson replied. They were not friends. They were not welcomed with open arms, but they were part of the landscape now, respected for their survival, acknowledged for their grit. They belonged. Spring came in a riot of wildflowers. The desert floor turned purple and yellow. The air was sweet with sage. The baby came in the middle of the night in April. This time, there was no storm, only the calm, vast silence of the stars. But the labor was hard. Clara fought for hours, her small body racked with pain. Mrs. Gable was there again, having arrived a week early to stay. Judson was banished to the kitchen. He paced. He walked through a hole in the floorboards. Every cry from the bedroom felt like a knife in his gut. He prayed. He bargained. "Take me," he whispered to the ceiling beams. "Take everything I have. Just let them live." He heard a final, wrenching scream, and then silence. The silence stretched. It went on for 10 seconds. 20. Judson stopped breathing. He moved toward the door, his hand trembling on the latch. Then, a sound. A thin, high wail. A cry of indignation and life. "It's a girl, Mrs." Gable's voice boomed. Judson threw the door open. The room smelled of copper and sweat. Clara was pale, her hair plastered to her skull, but her eyes were open and shining. In her arms was a small, red, squalling bundle wrapped in the white flannel. Judson walked to the bed. He fell to his knees. He looked at the tiny, crumpled face. He looked at the fists beating against the air. He reached out a finger. The baby's hand opened and closed around it. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Judson Hale, the man who had buried his heart 5 years ago, felt his chest crack open. A sob tore from his throat. He buried his face in the mattress beside his wife's hip and wept. He cried for the years he had lost. He cried for the violence he had done. He cried for the sheer, impossible miracle that he had been given a second chance. "Judson," Clara whispered, her hand on his head. "Look at her." He lifted his head, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. She is beautiful. She is strong," Clara said, "like her father." "What do we name her?" Judson asked, his voice thick. "Is she a hope or a faith?" Clara looked down at the baby, then at Judson. She saw the tears on his face, the face of a man who had believed he deserved nothing but dust. "No," she said softly. "She is Mercy, because we were spared, and because you showed me mercy when I had nowhere to go, and I showed you mercy when you were lost. Mercy." Judson tested the word. It tasted sweet. Mercy hail. Summer arrived, baking the land into hard gold. The ranch was thriving. The new calves were fat. The garden Clara had planted was producing baskets of beans and squash. One evening in late August, Clara walked out of the house. She carried a small wooden box. She walked to the cottonwood tree near the creek, the one where she had first washed the dust of the road from her skin, the one where she had sung her lullabies when she was a stranger. Judson was there, finishing a project he had been working on for a week. He had built a bench. It was simple, made of sturdy oak, sanded smooth and varnished to a high shine. It sat in the shade of the tree, facing the sunset. He watched her approach. He saw the box. "What is that?" he asked. Clara sat on the new bench. She ran her hand over the smooth wood. "This is the past." She opened the box. Inside was a dried sprig of sage, a piece of blue thread, and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. She took the paper out. She unfolded it. 3 times a day, "I will be your wife." She read it, a faint smile touching her lips. "I wrote this when I was terrified. I wrote this when I thought my only value was what I could do for a man. I thought I was making a trade." "You made a life," Judson said, sitting beside her. "I did," she agreed. "But I do not need the contract anymore." She placed the paper back in the box. She knelt by the roots of the cottonwood. Judson knelt beside her. He used his knife to dig a hole in the soft earth between the roots. They placed the box on the ground. They covered it with dirt. They patted it down. They buried the transaction. They buried the desperation. They stood up and sat on the bench, in the tall grass near the creek. A blanket was spread. Mercy was lying on her back, kicking her legs at the leaves that fluttered overhead. She gurgled, a happy, bubbling sound. Judson put his arm around Clara. She leaned her head on his shoulder. The sun was setting, painting the sky in riots of orange and violet. The air was cooling. "I fixed the gate on the north pasture today," Judson said quietly. "Good," Clara said. "The garden needs weeding tomorrow." "I'll help you," he said. "You will pull up the carrots thinking they are weeds," she teased. "I might," he chuckled. They sat in silence for a long time, watching their daughter, watching the land that was theirs. Clara sat up. She turned to him. She looked at his face, tracing the lines around his eyes that were from smiling now, not squinting against the glare. She reached for the coffee cup he had set on the bench arm. She took a sip, then held it for him. He drank. She leaned in. She kissed him on the lips. It was a warm, lingering kiss, tasting of coffee and evening air. She pulled back just an inch. She placed her hand on his shoulder, squeezing the solid muscle there. "Once," she whispered. Judson looked at her. His eyes crinkled at the corners. He grinned, a wide, boyish expression that took 20 years off his face. He pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her waist, holding her tight against him as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Don't stop there, wife," he replied. "The day isn't over yet." Thank you for listening to this story of Judson and Clara. I hope their journey from the dusty plains of New Mexico to a place of redemption resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. I invite you to share your thoughts on the story in English. I read every one. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.